Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. We have made it to part 10, the last meat and potatoes episode. This has been part of an ongoing 11-part series, including an introduction and a conclusion, which will be in the next video. We'll wrap things up with some closing thoughts, but if you're new, I'd recommend checking out the other videos in the series for the proper context. This video and this part in the series may make the least sense of all if you don't have the context. So, but yeah, we've come a long way. We've talked about Dr. Stevens himself and his coming to terms with reconciling behaviorism and attachment theory and how it led to his interest in archetypes, and then how those archetypes are biological in nature as well as psychological. We talked about various archetypes in depth: the mother, the father, and the role of the family. Talked about the shadow and how archetypal frustration can distort society in certain ways. So, we have a lot to cover, and this is going to be pretty quote heavy again. Kind of the more esoteric concepts having to do with the transcendent function. So, I want to try and get things right from Dr. Stevens rather than my personal ramblings. In this video, we'll be talking about dreams and symbols and how they tie into the broader archetypal theory, and then, of course, the transcendent function. And we'll start with the transcendent function, actually. We'll start with definition. Stevens says that defines the transcendent function as, quote, Jung's term for the mutual influence which is exerted between the ego and the capital S self in the course of personality development and individuation. So, in a sense, that's, as I say, like, so those. I understand he's speaking English here, but perhaps the meaning is a little subtle. It's TLDR. What I take from this is that the transcendent function is simply all the operations involved in your individuation. That's realizing your archetypal potential, doing shadow work, and just being transformed and living your life and learning what you can from it. He says, symbolism is the very essence of the transcendent function. And this is a bit abstract, but as we'll see, symbols contain archetypal power, and these are not arbitrary. And that's an element of the archetypal psychology sphere that we haven't really delved into that much. The fact that, and this is where the work of Joseph Campbell would come in, that symbolism is not arbitrary, that throughout the history of human civilizations that have died out or are still around, the same types of patterns, there are many commonalities, there are many universals, and this is not the subject of this series of videos. Joseph Campbell, that's like his claim to fame, that's his wheelhouse, especially with the hero's journey and the monomyth. Where does that come from? That comes from a meta-analysis of the myths and cultures and traditions of all of human cultures and human history that we know about. And these tales and these symbols contain right hemispheric language, which is the language of the intuition. We talked about that as well in the series, that the hemispheres kind of see the world very starkly from one another. And the process of individuation on the physiological level is largely healthy communication between the spheres. How they come together on an agreement of how they're interpreting reality. And the great Robert Bly, who I want to cover on the channel as well, his great book Iron John, I think he was the one who said this, that mankind can't help but live within a myth, which is like we live in our own stories, so to speak. But with what we've covered here, we know that these stories are largely archetypal, aka they're inbuilt. Archetypes are designed for survival, for us to survive and thrive as humans. And yeah, and individuation is largely an actualization of the inbuilt archetypes that we come ready-made for. So, check my notes here. Yeah, again, like bringing it full circle. Archetypes have like this connotation to them, like they're spiritual and new agey. And Stevens is kind of on a crusade to say that's all nonsense. This is biological. This is very serious. Nothing is more practical than archetypes. They are inexorably linked to our survival. And we've talked about that in more detail in previous videos. He says, technological innovation has, without question, produced wealth and comfort on an unprecedented scale, and through the peaceful use of nuclear energy, it could solve the world's prices and fuel supplies. But the shadow side of these developments is ugliness, noise, pollution, mineral exhaustion, and the extinction of a growing multitude of species in the probability of nuclear catastrophe. And again, I've mentioned this several times. Jonathan Peugeot's video about dwarves and goblins creating these great trinkets, these wonders, and yet being very trickstery. So like I always bring up the example of a car. Yes, a car can move us from one place to another efficiently, blah, blah, blah. They're great. However, the trickster element in them is that now we're atomized in these moving metal cages. We no longer interact with nature on our travels, so it's one step more removed from the human condition. We don't interact with other people on our travels. There's probably less community. If we have less opportunity for community, then our social skills suffer just every time we kind of take a trip, because if Aristotle is to be believed that, man is a social animal and virtue's like a muscle, you have to be in society to exercise the muscle of virtue. Thus, if you're independent, you're probably dangerous, and not in like in an endearing way. You're an idiot. Like, you have no idea what it's like to socialize with other people. How can people work with you, et cetera, et cetera. That was a lot to unpack, but really important stuff. I mean, yes, Stephen says, saddest symptom of all is the steady decay in the arts as they become increasingly under the dominance of the left hemisphere. Mathematical sequences and music, incomprehensible abstractions and painting, elaborate gimmickry and sculpture, all needing books or words to explain what they are about in conceptual terms instead of allowing them to speak directly in their own perceptual idiom for the right hemisphere where they belong. If a good wine needs no book, neither does a good painting. Okay? Yes. Again, right hemispheric is the intuitive, the image-laden, the non-logical, dreamlike. And this is all like, again, degraded in our highly left hemispheric society. And we'll be talking about King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, the book by Robert L. Moore. And the magician part of that is an archetype that he goes into, which is the part of, and these are archetypes he found in men throughout his research, of like the thinker, the tinkerer, the intellectual, right? But each archetype can be perverted. And one perversion is like the magus, which is someone who misses the forest for the trees, someone who's like missing all the lessons of history, but knows the lives of all the writers of history. It's like, maybe you want to internalize what they were trying to communicate rather than what kind of paper the lesson was printed on, you know? I don't know. But yeah, we have like an overly left hemispheric world. It's very data driven. What's the evidence, you know? And what's the evidence asked to a right hemispheric state of mind makes no sense. And one could find oneself a little at a loss for words. I just feel it or whatever. That's heresy these days. But maybe we need a little bit more of that. So Stevens explores the idea that the best times in history are when societies are thinking with both hemispheres. He says, instead of projecting our neurotic problems out onto society and seeking solutions for them out there, Jung believed that we should assume full personal responsibility for them and seek psychological solutions within ourselves. If Jung is right, then it could be that high culture occurs at those times in history when both hemispheres are equally functional and their activities are well and integrated. Stephen says, and this is coming from Jung, before individuation can be taken for a goal, the educational aim of adaptation to the necessary minimum of collective standards must be attained. Treatment consists, therefore, in facilitating the homeostatic propensities already at work within the patient. The Jungian approach to neurosis is not to denigrate it or attack it head on, for it too isn't it could be appropriate at the stage of development reached, an attempt, however imperfect, to achieve some kind of balance and to resolve the conflicts in the patient's life. And we talked about Stefan Molyneux's parable of Simon the Boxer in a previous episode. I didn't get through it all. I didn't even get to the boxing part. Hashtag YouTube noob. But TLDR, it's about Simon, who was unfortunately, abused physically as a child. So he adapted to that. He came to expect that. Now, when he's older and goes out into the world, his greatest strength is dealing with physical violence, but now that's maladaptive. Now he's unprepared. He feels anxiety. And that anxiety was what prompted him to develop those defenses in the first place, anxiety from being physically assaulted. But then he finds that when he steps into a boxing ring and physical violence is all around, he's like, oh, I can do this. I know about this. So he thrives, but stepping outside the ring, love, managing money, delay of gratification, sense of identity, etc., they're alien to him now. So are we to say he is maladapted? It seems like the Jungian approach says, yes, to a degree, but it's not to be condemned because we have deep sympathy for it. We understand that that's in place, that adaptation took place for a reason, right? So basically the goal is to utilize the inner resources already present in the client. And I think this is like really wildly optimistic. I think there's like a Bible passage about being equipped for whatever trials we face internally. Again, it's about mobilizing the resources that are already there. So, talking about, we're moving on to some symbolism, and I want to note this quick passage by Stevens on mythology and religion. He says, "We shall never entirely escape from our need for mythology and religion. It is too fundamental a part of our nature, deeply irrational though it may seem. Religious belief is planned for in the genome. People can no longer believe in God, yet they are programmed to believe in something. If God dies, they will find other vessels, however cracked, in which to pour their faith." And this, we talked about alchemy earlier. That sounds like alchemical language, about a sealed container in the prima materia. Check out the episode about transformation. Anyway, he says, both self and society need religion. Without it, both suffer and ultimately perish. A secular religion, like communism or fascism, which is more acceptable to the left hemisphere, will flourish for a time, but precisely because its tenets are man-made and therefore profane, it cannot last for millennia or provide criteria of absolute value in the manner of a sacred religion. It will be abandoned when men tire of it or they have found something better. And we talked about this in a previous video that, again, Stefan Molyneux spoke about this, that history is like a giant pendulum that swings back and forth between worship of gods and worship of the state. Meaning is the critical issue here. So this was what Jung was preoccupied with. Stevens explains that for Jung, one becomes psychologically distressed when his symbolic beliefs have lost their validity. That's a powerful statement and worth dwelling on, I would say. When this occurs, he says, one loses their tether to the great cultural history. The only treatment left for modern individuals is to look inward for symbolic formations, and this is what Jungian therapy would entail. And symbols, of course, are largely involved in dreams. So a little bit about that. Stevens explains that most interesting of all, in the light of Jung's views on dreams, is the suggestion that the neurophysiological purpose of dreaming is to promote integration of processes occurring in the limbic system with those of the cerebral hemispheres. Right. So we've talked about this before. And there's a hefty passage here, but it's worth noting. I think Michel Jouvet, that's how you pronounce it, maybe. He's a neuroscientist and medical researcher, and this is Stevens talking. Michel Jouvet believes that it is during this crucial early period that dreaming plays an indispensable role in organizing the archetypal biogrammar into the complicated behavioral and psychic sequences involved in mating, hunting, dominance, and the defense of the territory. He suggests that the function of dreaming is essentially to activate neurons that are responsible for programming patterns of our behavior characteristic of the species, aka archetypes. While these patterns are, of course, related to stimuli arising from the environment, the fundamental processes involved in integrating the archetypal biogrammar inherent in the genetic program into the developing behavioral repertoire has to occur at night. In his view, since it is only during sleep that the command neurons are free from the need to meet the demands of the environment normally encountered during wakefulness. And this is consistent with Jung, whose approach to dreams was fundamentally biological. A dream, like every element in the human structure, is a product of the total psyche. And we may expect to find in dreams everything that has ever been of significance in the life of humanity. He continues, I hold that the dream, this is Jung speaking in Stevens' book, I hold that the dream is a spontaneous self-portrayal in symbolic form of the actual situation in the unconscious. I take the dream for what it is. The dream is a natural occurrence, and there is no earthly reason why we should assume that it is a crafty device to lead us astray. It occurs when consciousness and will are to a large extent extinguished. Dreams, Jung believed, are the means by which the psyche maintains its equilibrium. Dreams, therefore, are the language used in lifelong dialogue proceeding nightly between the ego and the capital S self. They are the means by which the individual becomes physically related for the life cycle of his species. Jung's clinical observations are in agreement with the modern evidence that dreaming is associated with a preponderance of right hemispheric cerebral activity. Again, interrupting myself here. The contempt for anything not rooted in the hard scientists is at max volume these days in the left hemispheric dominated society. It was Stevens's wish to root Jungian archetypal psychology in the biological sciences, and I think he makes the case successfully. So to continue, Jung says it is characteristic that dreams never express themselves in a logical, abstract way, but always in the language of parable or simile. In sleep, fantasy takes the form of dreams, but in waking life too, we continue to dream beneath the threshold of consciousness. Stevens says, and this comes from Robert Ornstein, as Robert Ornstein has suggested, it is when the sun sets in the left hemisphere that the stars come out in the right hemisphere and assume the form of dreams. That's beautiful. His metaphor is pleasing, not least because the equating of the sun with the light of consciousness is very ancient, as it is with the setting with the night sea journey of the hero. Every night, the extraordinary adventure is repeated. The onset of sleep heralds the death of one day's measure of the conscious lifespan, and then the heroic ego concerns itself to the deep to hold communion with the ancestral spirits that reside there, gathering their wisdom and their guidance, prepares for the miraculous birth of another day. So, if I'm summing this up correctly, TLDR, dreams are a biological system leading us to biopsychological system leading us to balance when and where it's needed in the psyche by means of symbols, which have been known to drive the behavior of the species throughout its history. And now we're kind of speaking of the transcendent function again. I mean, anytime there's communion with the capital S self, whether it be with dreams or hemispheric communication, archetypal manifestation, etc., etc., these are all part of the transcendent function. It's simply the ego communing with the self. So Stevens says, it was Jung's contention that the two moral poles were capable of reconciliation. Awareness of the shadow means suffering the tension between good and evil in full consciousness, and through that suffering they can be transcended. If one can bring oneself to bear the psychic tension that the opposites generate, the problem is raised to a higher plane where the conflict is resolved, good is reconciled with evil, and a new synthesis follows between conscious and unconscious, between persona and shadow, between ego and self. Again, this is very alchemical language, especially like raising the problem to a higher plane. They talk about the albedo, I think. It's the color white in alchemy. And this is an inhuman place of the concepts where problems and creative solutions take place. But we'll hopefully talk about that in upcoming video series. He says, the reconciliation is attained neither rationally nor intellectually, but symbolically. And it was to this symbolic process that Jung gave the term the transcendent function. Through the transcendent function, the conscious personality and inner adversary are both transformed. As new symbols arise from the unconscious, the opposites are reconciled and transcended. The personality becomes better balanced, more integrated. So, yeah, we've been talking about the transcendent function the whole time. Again, it's not about being a good person. It's about being an integrated, individuated being. So, he says, the call to individuate is the call to become authentic, to live and affirm consciously one's own unique individuality to the extent that a man is untrue to the law of his own being and does not rise to personality. He has failed to realize its last meeting. One cannot live from anything except what one is. The aim of Jungian psychotherapy, in terms of the neurological model under discussion, to reduce the left hemisphere's inhibition of the right hemisphere and to promote increased communication in both directions across the corpus callosum, the transcendent function resides in a mutual influence of conscious and unconscious, ego and self, and Jung believed that there were two basic methods by which this mutuality could be brought about: the way of creative formulation, an active imagination, creative fantasy, dreams, symbols, art, and aesthetics, and the way of understanding, intellectual concepts, verbal formulations, conscious awareness, and abstractions. The therapeutic measures advocated by Jung, dream amplification, active imagination, symbolic expression through painting, sculpture, and music, all had the specific intention of promoting the integration and conscious and unconscious processes. Jung said, the more unconscious a man is, the more he will conform to the general canon of psychic behavior. But the more conscious he becomes of his individuality, the more pronounced will be his difference from other subjects, and the less he will come up to common expectations. Individuation is the process of forming and specializing the individual nature, which already exists a priori. It means the development of the individual as a personality, as a differentiated being from the general collective psychology. Individuation, therefore, is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. But it has to occur in full consciousness, for, quote, life that just happens in and for itself is not a real life. It is only real when it is known. So this kind of reminds me of when you grow in life, you often have to leave your old life behind. And we talked about transformation in the initiatory process, that there's an important symbolic death and rebirth when an initiation takes place. So Stephen says, without knowing it, Jung advocated a therapeutic approach which was predominantly right hemispheric, and it had to be to counter the left hemispheric basis of Western society. This part was very quote heavy, so I appreciate you sticking with me. Hope that all made sense, but I wanted to get through a lot of it as much as I could. This is the last part of Dr. Anthony Stevens' book, Archetype, that we'll go in depth on. Really hope you all have enjoyed the journey. I'll have one more video after this with some concluding thoughts about all this. Let me know in the comments, as always, what y'all think. And I really, really appreciate y'all taking the time with me on this. I'm looking forward to the next series with y'all. So take care. Have a good one. Have a good day. Bye-bye.